Long before his name became a symbol of hope in times of plague, there was only a child born into privilege beneath the bright skies of Montpellier in southern France. The wealthy celebrated his arrival with feasts and songs, believing that their noble heir had entered the world. Yet those closest to the infant noticed something that no celebration could explain. Upon his chest rested a crimson mark shaped like a perfect cross. Some whispered that it was merely an unusual birthmark. Others dared not speak at all, crossing themselves whenever they looked upon it. His deeply faithful parents regarded the mysterious sign as a gift from heaven. They believed God had placed his seal upon the child before he had taken his first breath. As the years passed, young Roch grew unlike the other children of noble families. While they learned the art of warfare, politics, and wealth, he found himself irresistibly drawn toward churches, monasteries, and places of prayer. Servants often discovered him kneeling silently for hours before a crucifix, his eyes closed in profound contemplation. According to ancient traditions surrounding his life, there were moments during these prayers when the mysterious cross upon his chest appeared brighter than before, as though reflecting a light invisible to everyone else. Whether miracle or legend, those stories spread quietly among the faithful, creating an aura of mystery around the young nobleman long before history would remember his name. Everything changed when tragedy struck. His parents died while he was still a young man, leaving behind enormous wealth, prestigious titles, fertile lands, and a future that most people could only dream about. Every expectation pointed toward a life of luxury, influence, and comfort. Instead, Roch made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He gave away nearly everything. The elegant robes disappeared, replaced by the rough garments of a humble pilgrim. Gold coins that could have secured generations of prosperity were distributed among the poor. The magnificent estate was abandoned. Carrying little more than a walking staff, a pilgrim's pouch, and an unwavering faith in God, he began a journey toward Rome. Europe, however, was entering one of the darkest chapters in human history. Death had become a constant companion. Entire villages vanished almost overnight. Roads that once bustled with merchants and travelers had become silent pathways, lined with abandoned carts and forgotten belongings. Church bells rang continuously, not to celebrate weddings or holy festivals, but to announce funeral after funeral. The Black Death had begun its terrifying march across the continent. People barely understood what they were facing. Some believed the plague was divine punishment. Others blamed poisoned wells, strange celestial events, or invisible curses. Physicians stood powerless against a disease that covered bodies with painful swellings, consumed victims with raging fevers, and often ended their lives within days. Most fled. The wealthy escaped to isolated estates. Nobles sealed themselves behind castle walls. Families abandoned even their closest relatives, fearing that one embrace, one shared meal, or one final goodbye might condemn them to the same horrifying fate. But Roch walked toward the suffering. Each city he entered revealed another nightmare. Hospitals overflowed with patients. Makeshift shelters had been transformed into wards where men, women, and children lay side by side, their desperate cries echoing through damp stone corridors. The air carried the overwhelming smell of sickness, infected wounds, smoke from burning herbs, and the constant presence of death. Many caretakers had already fled. Even priests sometimes hesitated before entering the plague houses. Yet Roch crossed their thresholds without fear. He knelt beside strangers whom everyone else refused to touch. He cleaned infected wounds. He carried water to the dying. He comforted children who had lost their parents only hours before. He whispered prayers into ears that many believed would never hear another human voice. His compassion astonished those who witnessed it. Ancient accounts and centuries-old traditions tell of extraordinary events that began to surround his ministry among the sick. They describe a man whose faith seemed to calm panic wherever he appeared. Some stories claim that Roch possessed an uncanny spiritual discernment. Looking into the exhausted eyes of the afflicted, he seemed to understand who was nearing death and who might still survive. Whether this reflected remarkable intuition born from countless hours caring for the dying or something believers regarded as a divine gift, those around him became convinced that heaven itself guided his steps. Even more astonishing were the stories of healing. Again and again, frightened witnesses claimed they saw Roch trace the sign of the cross over plague victims while praying fervently to Christ. Some chroniclers later wrote that patients who appeared beyond hope unexpectedly recovered, fevers subsided, strength slowly returned. Families who had already begun mourning found themselves embracing loved ones they believed were lost forever. The reports spread rapidly from city to city. Pilgrims spoke of a holy traveler whose prayers seemed to bring comfort where medicine had failed. Doctors, exhausted and bewildered by the relentless epidemic, reportedly watched these recoveries with amazement. While not every patient survived, enough remarkable stories circulated that crowds began searching for the mysterious pilgrim whenever disease reached their homes. Yet Roch never claimed personal power. Whenever grateful families attempted to praise him, he directed every word of thanks toward God. He insisted that any healing belonged to divine mercy, not to the hands that traced the cross. This humility only deepened the fascination surrounding him. Those who met him noticed something extraordinary in his demeanor. He did not recoil from horrifying wounds. He did not cover his face when approaching those abandoned by society. He treated each suffering person as though they possessed immeasurable dignity, regardless of how disfigured illness had left them. There were moments when the silence inside plague hospitals became almost unbearable. Rows of patients waited uncertain whether sunrise would ever come again. Candles flickered against damp walls. Outside, carts transported bodies toward hurried burials. Inside, Roch continued moving from bed to bed. One trembling hand after another reached toward him. Some sought healing, others sought forgiveness. Many simply longed for another human being willing to remain beside them during their final hours. His presence became a light amid overwhelming darkness. Word traveled beyond hospitals into marketplaces, monasteries, and villages untouched by his footsteps. Travelers carried stories across northern Italy, describing a French pilgrim who seemed immune to fear itself. Many believed they were witnessing a saint long before the church would ever recognize him as one. Yet beneath every miracle story lay a painful irony. Each day Roch spent among the infected increased the danger surrounding his own life. He washed diseased bodies. He lifted feverish strangers into his arms. He prayed inches away from faces burning with infection. Everyone understood what this meant. The plague spared almost no one. No amount of courage could erase the invisible threat surrounding every breath inside those crowded shelters. Friends quietly begged him to leave. Some warned that even saints possessed mortal flesh. Others insisted that his death would help no one. But Roch refused to abandon those whom the world had already abandoned. Day after day, he walked deeper into the heart of the epidemic, never knowing that every compassionate touch brought him one step closer to sharing the very suffering he had spent years trying to relieve. The hands that countless victims believed carried God's consolation would soon bear the unmistakable marks of the disease itself, beginning a trial that would test not only his body, but every ounce of his faith. Had you ever heard of Saint Roch before today? Have you or anyone you know ever received a blessing, a miracle, or the intercession of Saint Roch? Write it down in the comments below. I read every single one of your comments, and I'll leave a heart on yours. If this story warms your heart, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends and family so they can strengthen their faith too. The saints were forgotten once, and together, we will never let that happen again. The exile in the cave and the providential dog. For months, perhaps years, Roch had walked fearlessly into places that everyone else fled. He had comforted the dying, embraced the abandoned, and prayed beside victims whose families no longer dared to approach them. Every day he accepted the same terrible risk, believing that love demanded sacrifice even when death seemed certain. Eventually, the inevitable happened. The man who had spent countless hours caring for plague victims awoke one morning with a fever, unlike any he had ever experienced. At first, he tried to ignore it. Pilgrims often became exhausted after long journeys. Sleepless nights, endless walking, and constant fasting could easily weaken the body. Roch continued serving the sick, convincing himself that the burning sensation behind his eyes would soon pass. It did not. By the following day, every step became heavier. His muscles trembled with exhaustion, and waves of pain coursed through his body. His breathing became labored, while chills alternated with unbearable heat. Even before visible symptoms appeared, Roch understood the truth that he had seen so many times in others. The plague had finally claimed him. Soon afterward, a painful swelling emerged near his groin. The disease that had already taken countless lives now carved its unmistakable mark into his own flesh. The inflamed bubo grew rapidly, becoming intensely swollen and excruciatingly painful. Every movement felt as though a blade were cutting through his body. His fever rose relentlessly, bringing dizziness and moments of confusion. Walking became nearly impossible. The irony was heartbreaking. The healer had become the patient. Those who had once begged for his prayers now looked upon him with the same fear that surrounded every victim of the epidemic. Compassion struggled against terror, but terror usually won. People understood what infection meant. One careless moment could condemn an entire household. Some wept as they watched him suffer, yet they dared not come near. Others avoided him altogether. The same streets where grateful voices had once welcomed his arrival now emptied as he approached. Doors closed, windows were shuttered. Parents hurried their children indoors, not because they hated him, because they feared death. According to ancient traditions, Roch realized that remaining among the people would place them in danger. Rather than allowing others to risk infection while caring for him, he made an agonizing decision. He left the city alone. Every step into the wilderness demanded unimaginable determination. His fever blurred his vision. His swollen wound throbbed with unbearable intensity. His body weakened from dehydration and hunger. Still, he pressed forward until civilization disappeared behind him. Eventually, hidden among trees and rocky hillsides, he found a small cave. It was little more than a hollow in the earth. Cold, dark, silent. There would be no physicians, no companions, no comforting voices. Only solitude. There, believing that death was approaching, Roch surrendered himself entirely to God's will. The days that followed became a battle against both physical agony and crushing loneliness. His body wasted away. The infected wound continued to torment him. Every attempt to move sent waves of pain through his exhausted frame. Sometimes the fever became so intense that reality itself seemed to dissolve. Ancient accounts describe moments when he cried out in suffering, his voice echoing through the forest during long, silent nights. Nearby villagers occasionally heard strange cries carried by the wind. Some believed wild animals roamed the hills. Others whispered that restless spirits haunted the woods. Few imagined that the sounds came from a solitary pilgrim slowly dying in complete isolation. Yet even within that darkness, something extraordinary began to unfold. According to one of the oldest and most beloved traditions surrounding St. Roch, an unexpected visitor appeared outside the cave. It was a dog. The animal belonged to a wealthy nobleman who lived nearby, often identified in tradition as Gothard. Though historical details remain uncertain, the dog had been trained for hunting and faithfully accompanied its master each day. Then, without explanation, its behavior changed. Each morning, as bread was placed upon the nobleman's table, the dog quietly seized a loaf or a large piece of bread and ran away. Servants chased after it. The master himself reportedly tried to understand the strange behavior, yet the animal always escaped into the forest. Day after day, week after week, curiosity eventually replaced frustration. Where was the dog going? The answer lay hidden within the cave. There, beside the weakened pilgrim abandoned by the world, the faithful animal gently laid the bread before him. It asked for nothing. It expected nothing. Then it quietly remained by his side. The image became one of the most enduring symbols in Christian art. A saint, a cave, a loyal dog carrying bread. For countless believers through the centuries, this simple scene represented divine providence arriving through the most unexpected of messengers. The story did not end there. Ancient tradition also recounts that the dog repeatedly licked Roch's infected wound. Modern readers naturally understand that such accounts belong to the devotional tradition surrounding the saint, rather than established medical history. Yet for generations of Christians, the symbolism carried profound meaning. The creature everyone considered incapable of reason became an instrument of compassion. While many human beings fled in fear, an animal remained. While society rejected the diseased pilgrim, silent loyalty refused to abandon him. The contrast deeply moved those who preserved Roch's story across the centuries. Eventually, The dog's mysterious disappearances drew the attention of its owner. Determined to solve the mystery, the nobleman followed the animal into the forest. There, hidden within the cave, he discovered a sight that forever changed his life. Before him lay an emaciated pilgrim, weakened by disease yet remarkably peaceful despite his suffering. The nobleman immediately recognized that this was no ordinary wanderer. Instead of recoiling in fear, he approached with compassion. Tradition tells us that he began bringing food, water, and whatever assistance he safely could. More importantly, he offered human companionship to someone the world had forgotten. For the first time since leaving the city, Roch was no longer completely alone. Slowly, against all expectation, his condition began to improve. The raging fever subsided. Strength gradually returned to his exhausted limbs. The swollen wound began to heal. Whether viewed as miraculous intervention, extraordinary providence, or the natural recovery of a man sustained by unexpected care, believers throughout history saw God's hand at work within the darkest chapter of Roch's life. He had entered the forest expecting to die. Instead, he emerged transformed, not physically untouched. The plague had left lasting marks upon his body. His face appeared older. His frame had grown thinner. Years of hardship had altered his appearance so dramatically that even those who had once known him might struggle to recognize him. Yet something deeper had changed. Isolation had stripped away every remaining attachment to comfort, reputation, and earthly security. His faith had survived abandonment. His hope had endured suffering. His compassion remained unbroken, despite becoming one of the very outcasts he had spent years serving. The cave had become more than a place of illness. It had become a hidden sanctuary, where silence replaced applause, where weakness replaced strength, and where God's provision arrived not through kings, armies, or physicians, but through the quiet footsteps of a faithful dog carrying a simple piece of bread through the forest each morning, the nameless prisoner, and the mystery of the dungeon. After recovering from the terrible illness that had nearly claimed his life, Roch could have chosen a quiet existence. He had already endured more suffering than most people experience in a lifetime. His body bore the scars of the plague. His strength had been tested beyond imagination, and he had witnessed enough death to haunt any soul forever. Yet his journey was not over. With the same pilgrim staff that had accompanied him across countless miles, Roch turned his face toward home. Years had passed since he had left Montpellier. The young nobleman who had departed wearing simple clothes and carrying nothing but faith was now almost impossible to recognize. Hunger had hollowed his face. Long years under the sun had darkened his skin. His beard had grown thick and unkempt. The scars left by illness marked his body, while endless walking had bent his posture with exhaustion. He no longer looked like a wealthy citizen. He looked like a forgotten wanderer. Europe itself had changed. The plague had not only taken millions of lives, it had shattered trust between neighbors. Entire communities had become suspicious of strangers. Wars, political unrest, and social instability made every unfamiliar traveler appear dangerous. Roads were patrolled more aggressively, city gates were carefully guarded, and rumors often spread faster than truth. When Roch finally approached his homeland, he entered a place filled with uncertainty rather than celebration. No one recognized him. To the guards stationed near the entrance, he was merely another exhausted traveler arriving from distant lands. His weathered appearance immediately attracted suspicion. His silence, humility, and refusal to defend himself only deepened their doubts. Ancient traditions surrounding Saint Roch tell of one of the most heartbreaking moments of his life. According to these accounts, the local authorities believed he might be a spy moving secretly through the region during a time of political conflict. Unable to prove his identity, or choosing not to reveal his noble birth out of profound humility, Roch was arrested without resistance. He did not struggle. He did not demand special treatment. He did not remind anyone of the countless lives he had helped save. He simply lowered his head and accepted the chains placed upon his wrists. Some later Christian writers interpreted this silence as an imitation of Christ before his accusers. Whether motivated by humility, spiritual conviction, or complete surrender to God's will, Roch refused to seek honor through earthly titles. The irony was almost unbearable. The man who had crossed plague-ridden cities to care for strangers was now treated as a criminal in his own homeland. He was led through streets where he had once walked freely as the son of one of the city's respected families. No one knew. No one noticed. No one remembered. The prison that received him was a place built not for comfort, but for despair. Its thick stone walls shut out nearly all sunlight. Moisture seeped constantly between the ancient blocks, covering the floor with cold dampness. The air smelled of mildew, rusted iron, and stagnant water. Tiny windows, if they existed at all, admitted almost no fresh air. Every sound echoed endlessly. The rattling of chains, the footsteps of guards, the distant cries of other prisoners, the slow dripping of water from the ceiling. Days blended into weeks. Weeks became months. Months disappeared into years. According to long-standing tradition, Roch remained imprisoned for approximately 5 years. History cannot confirm every detail preserved by later hagiographies, but generations of believers have reflected upon this period as the final and perhaps greatest trial of his earthly life. Unlike the dramatic suffering of the plague, prison offered no heroic moments. There were no crowds witnessing miracles, no grateful families, no miraculous recoveries filling the streets with hope. Only silence, only waiting, only forgotten days passing one after another. Many prisoners eventually surrendered to bitterness. Some cursed their captors, others abandoned hope altogether. But accounts of Roch's life consistently describe a man whose faith remained astonishingly peaceful, even within complete isolation. His prison cell became another place of prayer. The same hands that had blessed plague victims were now folded quietly in the darkness. The lips that had comforted the dying continued whispering prayers known only to God. Every hardship he had endured seemed to prepare him for this final hidden sacrifice. The nobleman's palace had taught him that wealth could disappear. The plague had taught him that health could vanish overnight. The cave had taught him that loneliness could become a place where divine providence still appeared. Now the prison taught him something even deeper. That human recognition was never the true reward for a life of holiness. Outside the prison walls, life continued. Children were born, merchants reopened their businesses, travelers crossed Europe. Many who had once benefited from Roch's compassion likely never knew where he had gone. Some may have believed he had died during the epidemic. Others perhaps remembered him only as a passing pilgrim whose prayers had once brought comfort during terrifying days. Inside the dungeon, however, time moved differently. Every sunrise arrived unseen. Every sunset disappeared unnoticed. The seasons changed only through subtle shifts in temperature. One winter felt almost identical to the next. Then, according to tradition, the final day arrived. It was the 16th of August. Weak from years of imprisonment, hardship, and advancing age, Roch sensed that his earthly pilgrimage was drawing to its close. No family surrounded him. No friends held his hand. No crowds celebrated the extraordinary life he had lived. The man who had once walked fearlessly through cities ravaged by death now faced death himself in complete obscurity. Yet Christian tradition preserves one final extraordinary account. After Roch died, the prison guards eventually entered his cell. Instead of finding only darkness, they were confronted by something entirely unexpected. Ancient hagiographies describe a mysterious heavenly radiance filling the dungeon. A soft, brilliant light surrounded the body of the unknown prisoner, illuminating the cold stone walls that had remained dark for years. Those who witnessed the scene stood in astonishment, unable to explain what they were seeing. As they prepared his body for burial, another discovery followed. Beneath his worn garments, they noticed the distinctive cross-shaped birthmark upon his chest, the same mysterious sign that tradition says had accompanied him since infancy. Alongside him, later accounts also mention a written message identifying him as Roch, a servant of Christ who had devoted his life to caring for plague victims and asking God's mercy for those who suffered from disease. Only then did the terrible truth emerge. The forgotten prisoner had not been a criminal. He had not been an enemy. He had not been a spy. He was the very man whose compassion had crossed borders, whose courage had inspired countless people during one of Europe's darkest epidemics, and whose life had become a testimony of charity stronger than fear itself. Recognition came only after death. The prisoner who had entered the dungeon without a name left it remembered as one of Christianity's most beloved protectors of the sick. The silence that had hidden his identity for so many years gave way to stories that spread from city to city, carried by pilgrims, priests, and ordinary people who believed that the humble servant once forgotten behind prison walls would never again be forgotten by the faithful.